We live in these very, very complex systems, but they are intertwined and our fates are intertwined. And so I think, if the moral grounding is not enough for you, then I think the national security, the economic security, and the health security is a clear clarion call to the importance of our being vested in the flourishing of our global neighbors.
Welcome to System Catalyst, the show that cracks the code for making the world a better place. I'm your host, English Saul. Today, we have two incredible guests who know what it takes to make big systems change. Michelle Nunn is the president and CEO of CARE. She leads a team of thousands working in more than 120 countries. And under her leadership, CARE reached over 53 million people just last year. Before that, she co-founded Hands On Atlanta, helped grow it into Points of Light, the largest volunteer organization in the world, and ran it as CEO. She's joined by Richard Stengel, CARE's co-chair. Rick's career has spanned media, politics, and diplomacy. He was the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy in the Obama administration, spent 7 years as the editor of Time magazine, and even worked with Nelson Mandela on his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. These days, he's also an MSNBC analyst and author of Information Wars. Michelle and Rick, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Great to be with you.
So I want to start us out maybe with a few hopeful words. And so I'd love for each of you, if you have a story or if you have a moment or if you have just some type of kind of peaceful anecdote that you could share with us to kick off this podcast of something that happened maybe in the last week or the last month that is given you hope or that is funny or surprising. I'd love to just hear from both of you of what's something that's maybe bringing you joy or has brought you joy recently. So Michelle, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I would hearken back to a really challenging time over the last year, which was when the U.S. government put in place stop work orders for the humanitarian system. And it was sort of brought our work to a standstill. It was a very difficult time to navigate, and CARE had to transition over 1,500 people. We had to make very difficult calls, close down a variety of different programs that were providing critical services and support. And so that is a recipe for, a kind of real, I think, despair among so many people. One of the CARE's incredible team members is a woman named Bushra, who works in Yemen, is from Yemen, and has spent the last 10 years of the conflict leading humanitarian teams there. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do in any circumstance. And it's a difficult thing, as a woman to be a leader in Yemen. And yet that is what she has done with grace and courage and resiliency. She lost her job during this time, and she sent a note to her CARE colleagues. And the note was one of gratitude and incredible resiliency. And there was a line in it that said simply, "This is not the end of the story. We will go forward and bring CARE wherever we go." And over the last months, I have carried that with me in many settings and against many challenges, because I think that spirit of perseverance and determination and commitment, and also ultimately of hope, is the one that we need right now.
That's amazing. Honestly, when you just said that, Michelle, it gave me chills a little bit. I think that that's exactly what people need to hear, is that this isn't the end of the story. All right, Rick, are you ready to follow that?
I can't follow that. In fact, one of the things that has been actually inspiring to me is how Michelle has responded to all of the difficulties that she mentioned right at the top of the show. The organization has been resilient. She has been resilient. And it's a very trying time, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I would also say one of the things that does kind of reassure me is that I thought and wrote a bit about cognitive biases. The great Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. There is a bias that we tend to think that the world and the time we're living in is darker than it actually is. Steven Pinker's great book, The Better Angels, talks about the fact that we are actually living in one of the most peaceful times in human history. And yet, if you ask the woman in the street, there would be a sense that everything was falling apart. So, even though that trend has changed, the planet has brought more people out of poverty over the last 40 years than any time in human history by an exponential margin. So there are lots of good things that are out there that we don't actually acknowledge or feel gratitude for. So I find that consoling.
Thank you. That's a really important piece of just perspective, because I think I forget where I was, but I was watching Trevor Noah, and he said something similar, and he was like, it's not necessarily that we're worse off in the world, but we have all this access to media and information. So it's now we see what's happening. We have exposure to it. So it's there is a little bit of a bias going on that maybe the world isn't necessarily burning. It just feels like it because it's right there on our screens. So thank you both. Thank you both for starting us off in a really inspiring way. So I want to take us back a little bit to thinking about how has the U.S. traditionally engaged in the global aid system, and how has that changed over the years? What was your perspective of the U.S. aid system?
Yeah, I've been thinking and writing about this for a while. I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago for the 500th anniversary of my Oxford College, Christchurch, which is about the decline of democracy. But I went back to those early days of the Republic when there was a very different attitude. It was protectionist. Thomas Jefferson said in his first inaugural, "Beware of entangling alliances." George Washington said in his farewell speech, "America has no permanent friends and no permanent adversaries." We were very much about the sovereignty of our country because we were a new nation. We needed to be protected from the old world. And that basically lasted 150 years. And there was the first big change was Herbert Hoover's campaign for relief in Europe during World War I. And then one of the most striking things in history, the Marshall Plan after World War II, where the U.S. spent billions and billions of dollars helping European countries that had been ravaged by World War II, where more people died at one time than any time in history, and also helping our former adversaries, Germany and Japan. Really was an extraordinary act of both American generosity and American practicality, because one of the underlying notions of the Marshall Plan was that poverty, bad economies were the incubator of the terrible ideas that had happened during World War I and World War II: fascism, authoritarianism, communism, and the idea of helping both our adversaries and our allies was a way of kind of bringing a kind of more durable peace. So to your question, I actually think back to General Mattis, who was Donald Trump's first Secretary of Defense during his first term, who said at his confirmation hearing that every dollar you take away from diplomacy and economic support, I have to spend another dollar on a bullet. The integration of support and aid in terms of increasing our national security is just something that's indisputable, and I think people don't really give enough attention to it. And so the money that USAID used to spend, which was also animated by this practical idea during the Cold War that and we later got more into the democracy promotion business, but that if you support fledgling democracies and you support countries who are trying to resist the influence of authoritarian regimes, their prosperity is what gives them the ability to do that. And our aid was about relieving poverty, increasing prosperity, which in the end increased our security. So I do think it's a kind of a golden complementary situation, and the cuts that we've seen in USAID, I would argue, undermine our security and don't necessarily make any economic sense for us either. So
no, I mean, I think it's a really important kind of foundational place to start here, because I think that almost even before the USAID cuts, we were seeing kind of a growing gap between, what global aid was doing and looked like and what people interpret, United States people interpret as sovereignty or what is good for our country. And I would love, Michelle, for you to maybe kind of speak a little bit more about both how do we move from this point in time around these cuts and what it means to no longer be at the level of aid and generosity that we have been before, with honoring everything that aid has done. And Rick, to your point, the security and the safety that has come from that, while also taking into account these critiques, because there's one thing to have sort of the U.S. perspective, and then there's another thing to have the perspective of the global atmosphere, right? And from where I sit, the sort of global stage has been calling for aid reform for a very long time. So what does that mean? How do we hold these two things?
Yeah, I would say that we have to do some work to make sure that we do have an accurate picture of what aid has done. So let's make sure that we don't have a distorted sense of that. And so, for instance, that we don't think that the world has just gotten worse and worse over the last decades, when it's actually gotten better and better from a variety of perspectives, not all perspectives, but from the perspectives of poverty, from the perspectives of things like maternal and child mortality, and a whole host of global public health indicators. So I think the first thing is, how do we make sure that there is, a common understanding of the facts around the impact of aid, and so that's one thing. And I think we have our work cut out for us, because in the same way that when you ask people if poverty has increased or decreased over the last decades, they'll say it's dramatically increased. They also think that we give 20% plus of our larger GDP to international aid. It's less than 1%. So I think we need to do the right constituency building, the right fact sharing, and the right storytelling to ensure that people do have that information, and that we rebuild that constituency for aid, which I do believe the American people have a heart for and also understand as in our interest. So how do we better tell that story? I think and I think the sector has to do some self-reflection about why we haven't been as effective in communicating that as perhaps we should have been, or hopefully can be in the future. So that's one thing. The second thing is, what do we need to do to think about what the future is going to look like? So, this sort of dependencies, for instance, within the global public health system. I think well-intended efforts that perhaps were and have been incredibly important from a life-saving perspective, but we now need to transition to systems, sustainable approaches, right? So that you're not running clinics for one particular disease by an international entity, but you're helping governments sustain a holistic health system that enables them to address these issues. And so we do need to think about sustainable approaches going forward. I think we also are going to call upon the broader global community to think about that globalized investment into our infrastructure for everything from migration to climate. And so, I would make the argument that America is well served when we are a big player in that. I hope we don't cede our spot around that, because I think it means ceding our spot around influence, soft power, and a whole host of other things. But I think we will recognize that we will have a more globally supported development and humanitarian system. And then I think the third thing I would say is I think we have to think about what are more market-based approaches for sustainable capacity to drive change. And also, how do we ensure that we are building and catalyzing and supporting local ecosystems for their own leadership capacity, and that we're in solidarity, but that we are not displacing or in any way undermining that capacity for, again, sustained, ongoing, democratic, civil society, all of those things that we want to be a part of, that we can be catalytic and we can collaborate with. And frankly, that we can learn from other countries. It's not just about sharing. It's also about carrying forward examples of things that are happening around the world that are effective that we can bring home. So, I would say just recognizing our interdependence, but building a more sustainable system that is locally based and that has market drivers and also government sort of autonomy to carry forward in an ongoing way.
I really think that that's spot on. And it feels like, where we sit, despite a lot of the damage that has been done with the pulling of this funding, there's a system-wide conversation afoot. And there's a real opportunity and a real urgency to be in that, both from a U.S. perspective as well as a global perspective. So, Rick, to you, your expertise is narrative and storytelling and conversation. So, how do you bring people in to a system-wide conversation like this? I know you have all the answers.
I don't. And I'm smiling because when I was in the State Department, my boss was John Kerry. And he always said, you know what, Rick, we need, and I would sometimes help with speech writing. What we need is a speech, the theme of which is, there's nothing foreign about foreign policy. And I'd go, yes, okay. And, I've tried to write that speech 20 times. And there's also the line that he would use that foreign policy begins at home, which is sort of the beginning of trying to explain that. But the truth is, there is something foreign about foreign policy. We have that word foreign for a reason. And so I don't think anybody has truly cracked the narrative of how to make it easily embraced by the American people that the aid we give around the world actually makes the country safer, the world a better place, and is a good investment. I used to joke when I was talking to people who had a different point of view, and I would say, I know how to make the foreign aid budget less than 1% of the federal budget. And they'd go, yeah, well, how do you do that? Well, I'd say it is less than 1% of the federal budget. And so I think, Michelle was talking about this before. People have a very large misconception of how much this is in terms of the cost in terms of the federal budget. But what we need to do in terms of narrative is so what's the ROI on that? What's the return on that investment? And I would argue that it's very disproportionate. It's long-term. And it also, to use another example that Michelle used, it also increases the soft power of the American brand. And I mean, in many ways, we invented the whole idea of soft power, but now we're also, and maybe you're going to get to this later, we're competing, not only while we're reducing what we're doing, we're competing with China, which has radically increased the amount of money that it gives to foreign countries, either through aid or through loans or through building projects. But the China Belt and Road Initiative it dwarfs the Marshall Plan. It's over $1 trillion. And, is it the most generous thing in history? No, but it actually is having a huge effect. And I remember when I was at the State Department and I was in Africa talking to a foreign minister of an African country, and I had my State Department talking points. And afterwards, he said to me with a smile, "You come and talk to me about transparency and human rights, and the Chinese come and build me a superhighway. Who do you think I'm going to listen to?" It's hard to respond to that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a really good point. And, when we're thinking about systems, there's so many stakeholders, there's so many players. And I think sometimes where, to your point, Rick, where it's hard to demonstrate or show or make accessible the impacts of foreign aid to the immediacy of the American people. And so, Michelle, I kind of, putting you on the spot a little bit with your work with CARE. I mean, I'm lucky enough, I sit on the board of CARE, so I get to witness this. I get to see the work that you all do and participate. And so tell me an example, give me a story of when the system worked, aid worked with government, with philanthropy, with the community. Give me an example within CARE where you see this working that we can illustrate to our listeners of like, no, when done right, it works. And it does result in all of these things that we're talking about.
Well, I think one of the challenges when we talk about systems change is people they can't see that, right? It's hard to, a visual picture does not come to mind when you talk about systems change. And I think one of the challenges for our sector has been also that it's a sector of wonderful technical experts who've spent years studying this work, and we need them to have the expertise that they do about how to change water systems or how to ensure agricultural, technical utilization of the right seeds for drought resistance and all of those things. But it can lead us to speak in a way that's not so easy to understand. And also, people do need individual stories to enter into a system. Like, we all need an entry point. We talk about our partnership with MasterCard, which helped to ensure that women who were micro entrepreneurs, which just means they didn't have a whole business, in terms of employees, but they had a small business. They were raising chickens, or they were raising goats, or they were, had a small business to help make dresses or whatever it might be. And they don't have access to credit. So they couldn't get, $100 loan or $1,000 loan in order to grow their ambition. So they were sort of stuck. And we worked with the banks in Pakistan and Vietnam and Peru. And we said, you know what? It's an obstacle for women if they have to have their husband co-sign this to guarantee a loan. And there are 5 other obstacles here. Let's change the product that you're offering. And in doing that, we've released over $250 million worth of loans to small women entrepreneurs. Like, that's a sustainable product that those banks it's become one of their most important products. So again, that's changing the system, but it's doing it in a way that is changing the lives of individuals and the capacity for women to carry their communities along with them in their own economic success.
I think that right there is the crux of it. So, Michelle and Rick, double down on this point for me, because I think it's a really important one. I understand as a human in the world, my humanity, and I believe this, my humanity is wrapped up in the humanity of other people in faraway places. But why should my listeners care about a woman in India getting credit? Just explain that to me. Maybe Rick, you first.
By the way, that concept that you mentioned about us all being interconnected, that's very similar to what Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Tutu talked about, the idea of Ubuntu, which is this idea that it's actually a Zulu phrase, which I don't want to mangle, but Tutu translated it as we are people through other people. We are human beings through other human beings. And, that in some ways is the core idea of what we're trying to do. And actually, Michelle can probably give you a better reason for why helping a woman in India, a more positive reason, helps us all. I'm going to use a negative example, which is something that happened, I remember, during the first Obama term, which is the money we spent in West Africa on Ebola prevention. Prevented Ebola from coming to the United States. When you stop spending money to prevent Ebola and sending those machines and doctors and medicine to eradicate it, well, it expands. It's much nicer to also talk about good expanding, but bad expands too. And part of what our aid was all about is selfishly preventing something bad from happening elsewhere from coming to the United States. And that has been a feature of American aid from the beginning. And it's, twice blessed in the sense that it helps the folks there and it helps us here. So what's not to like about it?
Absolutely. Michelle, thoughts?
Yeah. Well, Ubuntu is what exactly came to mind for me, but it's true in literally every faith tradition, and that concept of our interdependence. And so I think we start with that, both moral truth, but also I think pragmatic truth. And it's true that none of us are an island into ourselves. So John Donne and the idea that we truly are dependent upon one another. And that's always been true in terms of our neighbor. We now live in an interdependent world, right? So you couldn't expect your neighbor to, all of your neighbors to be doing poorly while you sat in a castle and prospered. That's not the way it works. And that's not the way it works now with our global neighbors. And so that's certainly very manifestly true when you think about health security. And we certainly saw that with COVID, that there's no way of literally forming walls that protect us from viruses in this day and age. And we need to think about preventative, preemptive health security. And that is very much a part of the aid system. If you think about that also from an economic security perspective, so you think about those women in India, think about what an important trading partner India has been and is now, what an important player they are to the global economy. That remunerates directly back to us and our own prosperity. The majority of our current trading partners have at one point been the beneficiaries of U.S. aid. And so, our economic security, you then think about national security. If India, if there is a fragility born from the lack of economic progress that leads to conflict, that leads to potential issues of terrorism, all of those things rebound to us. Again, back to economic security, back to health security. We live in these very complex systems, but they are intertwined and our fates are intertwined. And so I think, if the moral grounding is not enough for you, then I think the national security, the economic security, and the health security is a clear clarion call to the importance of our being vested in the flourishing of our global neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and the data reflects that, right? Like it's hard to argue against that from a concrete point of view of basic data and statistics. So on this podcast, what we really do is we focus on the movers and shakers that are moving and melding the systems. And so people who are listening are really interested, in sort of what you both are doing as system catalysts, what CARE is doing. And I think we've really chatted about that a lot today. And as we come to a close, I'd love for each of you, one of the things I like to do is sort of leave our listeners with a question. So what is the question that, later on this evening when folks are out to dinner or sitting, at home on their back porches, what is the question that you want to leave our listeners with pondering today, for themselves, for the future? So maybe Rick, I'll start with you. What is the lingering question? that you have?
Well, I think in some ways, English, you posed it, which is this, and in some ways it's a straw man about like, what is the benefit of aid? What is the benefit of foreign aid? And I think it's worthwhile people thinking about it, because I think there is a good answer to it. And to the fact that our whole network and system of aid is undergoing change, what would you do to make it more sustainable? And this is something Michelle thinks about all day, every day, because we did get a tremendous amount of money from USAID. How do we create programs that are self-sustainable? Our Village Savings and Loan Program is something that can be self-sustainable. And using and being much more attuned to market-based solutions, as Michelle said. How do you come up with systems that are philanthropic and beneficial and also market-based? And I think that, to go to Michelle's nice point about what's in our DNA, I was a big reader for years of evolutionary biology, and there was that idea of reciprocal altruism is in our DNA. That's why we survived as a species. How do you create reciprocal altruism in a market-based way that's sustainable, that actually does all the benefit that we want? I think that's the big question.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll take it from the macro, because I think you so well articulated that, to more of the sort of personal question. I think we're all asking ourselves at this moment, what are we called to do? We're always asking that question, but this seems like a particularly, challenging time in a lot of ways, a very complex and chaotic time. And so, I've been thinking about it when I think about all of the challenges that are mounting up for us organizationally, from humanitarian system, in terms of the enormity of the number of humanitarian crises, the volume, the threshold, and also some of the fundamental institutional challenges to resourcing. I've been thinking, it's actually a privilege. I've been trying to turn it around. It's really a privilege to lead at this time, because it's such an important time for our sector. And it's such a time of transformation and potential, the potential enormity of answering the questions that Rick just posed. So, and then I think at a very personal level, I think for all of us thinking about what is our platform for change making, and, in this, to paraphrase others, that to say, what is this sort of intersection between our talents and gifts and the world's needs? How do we answer that question for ourselves? And how do we answer that question in this particular moment? And so that's the question I've been posing, for myself. And I think maybe others are also thinking about as well.
Wow. This has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed talking to you guys, and there's probably about 60 questions that I didn't ask you. Right. So I really can't wait to have you both back maybe next season to talk about all of the amazing things that we were able to accomplish during this time. And I think that this is a really potent conversation. It's going to leave a lot of I think just pondering and questioning with our listeners, and also a lot of inspiration. So thank you both so much for joining me today.
So fun to be with you both. Thanks so much, English.
Thank you, English.